Hello, everyone. I hope you've all had great weekends. I've had a smashing day, having just finished second in my dance competition. And more importantly, I've just met Maurizio Vescovo, who is basically, in my opinion, history's greatest dancer. He was one of the judges today, and I finally got to shake his hand, have a selfie, and all that. Photos to come up on Instagram. Anyway, I am so excited that I've decided to find a quiet room in the venue while they pack down and all that sort of stuff. And do this recording on philosophy and thoughts about the world. How geeky am I, right? But I'll tell you something. Once you find the things in life that make you happy, it's a real blessing. When I'm happy, I do philosophy. I think, I make and break theories, analyze systems of explanation, try to apply them to the world. And I dance, I get music. I listen to, even when I'm doing my warm up, I'll put something that's completely unrelated to ballroom and Latin, a soundtrack, Beethoven, whatever, and to see how my body moves. So I have found the things that make me happy, things that are with me when I'm happy, things that are with me when I'm sad. And I hope you all have managed to find something like that that's so much a part of who you are. Anyway, on with the show. So, today's reflection. So we all know that this war in Ukraine has lasted about 2 months now, and it has been, like all wars, predictably unpredictable. It has already meandered through lots of unforeseen twists and turns. How it will end, no one really knows for certain. I do, however, believe that there's another question, perhaps even more important, that no one is asking, which is, what will Russia do at this war's end? And especially after the end of Putin. So I'd therefore like to consider the political future of Russia itself. No matter what happens to Putin, and I believe his end is, very imminent, because he has just made too many mistakes. Despite all this, the tragic reality of Russian political life is that it has a tendency to produce and reproduce tyrants. And we in the West and the world over, we wonder how the Russian people, its private sector, its aristocracy, its civic bodies, when they have suffered most because of people like Putin, have not found a way to prevent such monsters from continually accessing power, or at least from stopping them turning into monsters whilst they are in power. It's as if the collective Russian mind believes that there is no real alternative, or that their heart just doesn't have access to the empowerment and the happiness and all the spiritual riches of what the rest of us have come to call freedom. So it is as if they have... It's sad, isn't it? They basically accepted a version of reality and national purpose where the people exist only to be stepping stones for those who are fated to be in power. And that once in power, it is then in the interest of all to supplicate themselves, even at the cost of their own lives, to the will and threats of those in power. So, since the beginning of this war, I have repeatedly said that Putin must realize that this war is not about Russian power, NATO, prestige, or even about Ukraine and where it really belongs. This war is about himself and his own ideology. And the question is, how do the Russian people stop the chain of tyrant production that goes back to people like Ivan the Terrible and are now manifested in Putin? How do they stop Putin's successor from becoming like him? And here I make a controversial proposal. I think that Russia must become a constitutional monarchy in the style of some of today's European countries. The Tsar must return. So, let me explain myself. Russia suffers from what all democracies suffer from, which is namely the conjoining, the putting together of what I will call power and rule. Those are two things. In the seat of a single executive office. So, I will distinguish power from rule using the British Constitution. It's what most of us are familiar with. Power is simply the mandate to govern, supplemented by legislative and executive tools. This includes the mandate to run the economy, establish civic orders and functionality, and running the military, running public infrastructure and institutions like health and transport and education. In Britain, this mandate falls directly under the Parliament at Westminster, and it is Parliament that has the power to run the country. Furthermore, it is Parliament that determines who sits in the executive office of power. Parliament itself is democratic, which means that there is a direct line between the people and its members, the members of Parliament, and a dotted line between the people and the executive, what we call the cabinet, headed by the Prime Minister. However, because Parliament constitutes a party system and the executive can only be formed by the majority party, the line between the public and the executive, though dotted, is actually quite short and very direct. There is no contention or grievance suffered by the public that would not be immediately felt and considered by the executive. Just think of Brexit and how hard it was for Theresa May to get a deal. It was a mess, and Parliament was divided because the people were divided. So basically, democracy functions quite well in that regard. In short, it is the job of our ministers to run the country, and it is we whom they are ultimately accountable to. So being a minister in Britain is a normal job with measurable KPIs, weighed heavily under the keen public eye and the eye of the media. We are basically their consumers. Anyway, so this is my definition of power, the mandate to run the country. Rule, on the other hand, is something far more mysterious. It is softer, it is deeper and bigger than power. And political science, even after millennia of stipulating and theorizing and postulating, has still left unappreciated this ethereal factor in the life of nations, perhaps because it doesn't easily lend itself to the bite and rigor of science. Nevertheless, human society, we all know, like its constituents, we're basically too complex, too dynamic and mysterious to put a lot of who we are into theories and then claim that we are best governed through this system or through that. We can scarcely do this with theories of the physical sciences. So what I'll do is I'll simply highlight some of the recognizable features of rule. The main feature of rule is collective identity. There's something about us that needs to belong to a group, to be accepted by this social group, even sacrifice for it. It makes a group member feel that they are part of something bigger that will outlast them. Furthermore, human groups cannot successfully define themselves without a group leader. And for some reason, they usually regard this leader as the embodiment of their identity and their purpose. Now, it is not something that I think... it's the evolution of societies has had it that the identity leader has at the same time been the political executive leader, i.e. the leader of power. But since the English Restoration in 1660, this has not been separate. Rule and power has been constantly been distinguished, at least in the British Constitution and British history. Nevertheless, every human group has always needed a figurehead who exists for no other reason than to be the center of the group identity, to represent and embody the people, to define who they are, to be almost the spiritual guide and the purpose for which they conduct their social, daily, cosmopolitan lives. Now, whether or not this is actually a flaw of human society is, I don't know, I'm not asking this question. It doesn't matter here. It's simply who we are. So let's look at a few examples in history that reveals what a ruler means to its people, what the seat of rule means. The first comes from antiquity, in Roman society after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Yes, we know that the Romans hated kings, but all the military despots, think of Pompey, think of Sulla, had shown that an identity gap still existed in the national life of the Romans, a gap that was not being filled by the body of the Senate, a gap that was actually there for the taking and was eventually taken by Gaius Julius Caesar for no other reason than that he brought glory to the name of Rome, and the Romans loved him for it. Indeed, Caesar was loved so much that even after his death, they would name the subsequent emperors after him, as if to signify that he lived on through them. Remember, this is all about identity and about pride. Caesar is not remembered because of his policies, but because of that deep, big, soft part of national life, identity. The Romans would rather be defined by a dead Caesar than by a living Senate. And that was the case no matter how well the Senate exercised its governing powers. On to more recent examples. It is well accepted that once countries go through revolutions, a period of great and usually violent instability follows. Now, France is probably the easiest example to pick out, but we often forget that the American Civil War was a conflict involving the seat of rule and identity as well. I'll use the two interchangeably. The South in America simply did not regard Lincoln as a person who embodied their identity, and this conflict has lasted right until today. And it has actually very little to do with slavery anymore and has everything to do with identity. And the 2020 election exposed this. Republicans did not need Trump to stay because of his policies. I think that they did this. I actually don't think so. He was simply their man in the seat of rule, the man who represented them, the man who restored their pride, who embodied their identity. It is the contention over rule and not power that sees Americans divided politically even until today. Think also of the newer nations in the world. In Kenya, for example, where I'm from, elections are hardly ever contentions about government policy. Kenyans don't really care about this. Elections are about determining the ruler of their country, and this is done on tribal grounds. There are no ideologies, no left-right continuum, just blood, race, identity. Election campaigns are therefore little other than the lining up and merging of groups to contest the other mergers and conglomerations of other groups. That's all election campaigns are. They are seldom discussions about policy. Policy will be thrown into it, but it's not what will capture the people's imaginations and stir their loyalties. Now, when I think of Kenya and the institutions she inherited from Britain, I'm tempted to think, what a waste. But it isn't. She inherited what I consider to be Britain's greatest export, which is, the parliamentary system of government. And most former colonies, until today, have exemplified that this has worked out well. It is the former British colonies that have performed best economically and politically in the post-colonial world. And I think the parliamentary system has much to be credited for in regard to this. However, what most of these countries did not inherit was the British Constitution. Installing a parliament is one thing. Capturing the loyalty and imagination of the people is another. In fact, there are only 3 major former British colonies that adopted the constitutional monarchy system: Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And for this reason, I believe, they very quickly became the most prosperous and stable nations in the world. There were some things that were just not up for grabs for their political leaders that lead to all the corruption and contentions that we see in many republics today. Their job is simply to govern. You will never hear of election strife and uprisings in these countries in the way that most republics, including America, have to go through. But perhaps the most famous example of what a ruler means is given by interwar Germany between the First and Second World Wars. It's more widely appreciated, perhaps, in the academic sphere, but less so in the public sphere, that the downfall of the Kaiser in 1918 and the subsequent establishment of the German Republic at Weimar played a definite part in the forming of Nazi Germany. And it's appreciated even less still that due to this void of identity left by the Kaiser, the Kaiser vacuum, we might say, someone like Hitler was always going to follow, in the way that someone like Napoleon was always going to follow the death of Louis XVI. Germans were keen on getting a socialist party and government, yes, but it was an identity figure that they needed. That forms a strong explanation of why they fell in love with Hitler too easily. It took someone like a Hitler to fill the Kaiser void. Hitler became Germany, and Germany became Hitler. And despite all the blessings and trappings of the democratic government at Weimar, it was easily discarded as an enemy of the people. So when Churchill suggested that Kaiser Wilhelm II should abdicate not in favor of a German republic, but in favor of his infant grandson to replace him as Kaiser under, obviously, a regency rule, Churchill was predictably spurned by the public opinion of the world, which had already started to be dominated by the preference of American Republican ideology driven by President Wilson. Now, American presidential system is noble and stands for the highest values of man. However, it is still an ideology, and eventually ideas are tried and tested and refined by the furnace of hard, grounded, brutal, inscrutable reality. They are only as good or as true as how well they work. And I say that the infant Kaiser at the seat of rule in Germany would have valued the people, and they would have seen someone like Hitler for who he really was. And I think that played a definite part in contributing to the Second World War. In other words, if Germany had kept a constitutional monarchy, we might not have had a Second World War. In fact, I don't think we would have. And even today, these lessons have not been learned. You don't just place democratic institutions into an Iraq or an Afghanistan and expect them to work as nations. In Kenya today, like so many new countries, so much virtue and progress has been mindlessly consumed, election after election, decade after decade, because the rule question has just not been resolved in the collective mind of the people. All because the seat of power is also the seat of rule. So when the British or Australians or the Dutch or the Spanish, all these constitutional monarchies go to the polls, they ask little other than whether the contenders are up for running the country. They don't ask who these people are, where they're from, their race, their gender, their religion, or anything else other than their policies, and whether they have and or will deliver on these policies. This is true because these countries already have a figurehead of an identity, or at least have that question resolved. I don't think the Queen is at the center of Australian identity, but that identity question is not being asked because of the there we have an email. That identity question has already been resolved. So a center of identity sufficiently removes from the contentions of power, the controversies and the corruptions of all the things involved in what we call politics. Anyway, that is a background. Let's turn to Russia. Putin's aim has not been to deliver prosperity for the Russian people. Again, that's what he thinks, but it isn't really his aim. He has been hell-bent on restoring Russian dignity, the Russian name. This is not the role of a politician or someone in power. It is best set for a ruler. However, like the medieval kings and to some extent the president of republics today, he was always going to have to do really dirty things to secure his position as ruler through his position as the person of power. First, whether he intended to or not, he has had to put himself into a position where he must liquidate political opposition. Monarchs don't have to do that. They're just born into the role. He has to completely take control of all media. He has had to secure his wealth through immense corruption. I mean, in Britain, we go on and on about scrutinizing the public, the consumption of our funds by the monarchy and so on. But the monarchs will never be corrupt. They will never have to do horrible things to take money for themselves. It's just an implicit contract we have because they represent us. Putin has had to suppress his own people, and he's had to do this also that he can be the ruler he wants to be, or that he thinks he wants to be. He has mixed power with rule, and more fatally with longevity. Now, that means that every mistake he makes, I'm telling you, when you're in a position of power, the longer you are, the more mistakes you make, and perhaps the more critical they become. So if you put all these things together, every mistake he has made in terms of power has affected his position as a ruler. Now look at what he's doing in Ukraine. It is 100% a political war, not a military war. If all the military advice tells him that he should leave Ukraine, he can't do that because of political reasons. He has to. He's doomed to make certain mistakes. This means that he's achieved all the ambitions of, I'm going to be theological here, of hell. Basically, he has been turned into that person where he ceases to be a completely he ceased to be a moral person altogether. He doesn't have moral reasoning. All that is left of him, because of all that corruption, all that power, all his mistakes, is his survival and whether his will prevails. Right and wrong, I don't think are any more in his calculus. My claim is that it is not only a reflection of his evil character, and he has had to become evil, but also a systematic failure of the Russian system. And it seems to urge its political leaders to become rulers. It's almost as if the Russian identity is insecure, and these political leaders need to prove themselves not as political leaders of power, but as rulers. Now, this is a serious problem. It means that Russia is on a path of inviting another Putin to lead the nation. Another person who may feel that they are destined to make Russia great again, or however you want to phrase it, but will already be predetermined to cause the very evil and decline that they wish to avoid in the first place. And I think that there's one way to secure the greatness of the Russian name, and that is through democracy. And in particular, this is shown by constitutional monarchies. They are just the most stable, or certainly amongst the most stable. And this political stability has one necessary opponent that has been tried and tested over time, and that is the dispute over rule must be settled. So, is there another way for Russia to stop the chain of despotic reproduction? By the way, I'm happy to be wrong, people, but in my opinion, I think the separation of power from rule is necessary. And a constitutional monarchy in the systems that we know, I think, is one of the best solutions for the Russian future after this war. After Putin goes, I believe Russia must restore its Tsar. I firmly believe that in this formula lies the true Russian greatness and prosperity for its people, where someone like Putin cannot use identity and allegiance as a way to hide behind his own incompetence and evil, as he is doing now. The Russian people will be able to judge their political leaders on their performance alone, without feeling that they may be hurting their own identity, which is exactly what Putin is trying to make them feel. This would avoid the evils of both the Putins and the Stalins and the incompetence of those people like Nicholas II, where the ruler was also forced to be the person in power. Anyway, that is my proposition. I very much appreciate your feedback and your thoughts. I hope you all have a good week to follow.